All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to finish up the urinary system. So we've learned about our cardiovascular system, which delivers nutrients and oxygen to our cells and then takes waste and carbon dioxide away from those cells. Our respiratory system, which brings in oxygen and helps us get rid of carbon dioxide, which is one of the waste products from cellular respiration, that process in the mitochondria whereby we make ATP. Right? I keep saying these things like, oh, I think maybe they're important, right? And then we learned about our digestive system, so the ways that we bring nutrients into our body, so both glucose, which we're going to use for energy primarily, as well as amino acids and fatty acids that we will use to build structural components of our body and our body cells. And now we're doing the urinary system. So the urinary system is a way of getting rid of additional waste products. So carbon dioxide is not the only waste product that's generated by our cells. So we've talked about things like urea, ammonia, uric acid, right? So we need to get rid of those waste products. So here we are in the urinary system. So just to remind you, right, we have two kidneys back here, just inside those back ribs there. And then we have two ureters, one on each side, that will drain the urine produced by the kidneys down into the bladder, where it will be stored until it becomes of sufficient volume that the bladder decides it's time to empty. The smooth muscle in the wall of the bladder will contract, indicating to you that it's time to go. If you don't want to go just yet, your voluntary sphincter of skeletal muscle will make sure that you do not empty your bladder, right, until it is an appropriate time to empty it. And then you'll do that through the urethra, which is the tube that leads out from the bladder to outside of the body, which happens to be much longer in male-bodied individuals than in female-bodied people. All right, so there's a little review of anatomy. And then so we started talking about the functional capacity of the kidney, and the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, this little microscopic structure made of blood vessels and tubules. So you remember, we have basically continuous blood flow going in one direction, side by side with the filtrate. So filtrate is our baby urine, right? When it's done, we're done making all the adjustments, we'll call it urine. But until the entire process is complete, we'll call it filtrate, okay? So you'll remember that there are 4 jobs the nephron is going to do for us in order to filter the blood, get waste out of it, and produce urine. The first one is filtration, then we have reabsorption, secretion, and then water balance or water conservation. All right, so that first one, filtration, happens in the glomerulus. This is all review from last time. I just want to refresh it in your mind. Right, so blood is coming in through the afferent or incoming arteriole into this little ball of capillaries. And it's going to leave through an efferent or outgoing arteriole. But while it's here in this little ball of capillaries, smaller molecules will move across the capillary walls. These are very special capillaries, and out into this space called Bowman's capsule. So small molecules are things like what? Do you remember what things move across? You can just call it out. You know this. Or you're like, oh gosh, I really forgot. Okay. Or you're just shy, which is fine. I get it. It's a weird day. You know, the sky was orange this morning because of the fires in Colorado, actually. Pretty crazy to think. It is a small world after all. But so the small molecules that are going to move out here in a passive process, just based on size and whether or not they can fit water, glucose, amino acids, and most of the waste molecules like creatinine and urea and ammonia and uric acid, those are pretty small. So they're all going to move across. About half of the water and those small molecules is going to stay in the blood because this is passive. Right? We're not actively working to get a higher concentration of something on one side versus the other. So about half are going to stay back in the blood. And also back in the blood are going to be our proteins, because those are larger molecules, right? Multiple amino acids hooked together, and our blood cells. Those will stay inside the bloodstream. So that's filtration. The second one is reabsorption, because some of those small molecules that moved out into the filtrate are nutrients that we don't want to lose, right? So we want that glucose back. We want those amino acids back. We don't want to lose those. And we're going to try to pull all of them back out of the filtrate and into the blood. So if we want all of the glucose and amino acids inside the bloodstream and none of it in the filtrate, which is just on the other side of this membrane, it's going to take ATP. That's going to be active transport, and we're going to need special proteins to do that for us, to do that work. So reabsorption is going to be active. Normally in a healthy, functioning body and kidney, 100% practically, like 99.9% of glucose and amino acids will be reabsorbed. We don't want to lose those nutrients in our urine, right? We worked hard to get them into our body and into our bloodstream. We don't want to pee them out. Okay. Sodium we will reabsorb depending on what's going on. So now we're going to talk about the second two, secretion and water balance or water conservation. I think I use the two terms interchangeably. Apologies. All right, so Sam was just diagnosed with strep throat. We had like 3 people diagnosed with strep throat at Student Health Center in the past couple days. That's more than we usually have. But anyway, he gets treated with penicillin, an antibiotic. Now, if you've ever taken penicillin, it doesn't smell very good, right? So you never want to stick your nose in the bottle and smell it. You just want to kind of swallow it without smelling it. But he notices that now whenever he goes pee, his urine also smells bad, and it smells kind of like the penicillin, right? So he's like, what is going on, right? This smells really weird. And so obviously what's happening here is secretion. So when we talk about secretion, this is job number 3. What we're doing now is some of those molecules that, yeah, half of them moved over into the filtrate during job number 1 filtration, but half of them stayed behind in the blood. So there are things in the bloodstream that we don't want there. Waste molecules, right, like urea, excess hydrogen ions, right? If our blood pH is low, our blood is a little too acidic, excess hydrogen ions, and many drugs, many medications, right? Drugs, medications, same thing. It's just a difference whether you've been prescribed them or not, right? So what we want to do is we want to say there's still some of this stuff left in the bloodstream, so we want to push it out into the filtrate, into the tubules, into what will become the urine. So since these are waste, these are things we want to get rid of, we want to get all of it out into the filtrate. So this is going to, again, be an active process. It's going to require work to do that and move it against its concentration gradient. So secretion is moving things from the blood to the filtrate. Reabsorption was taking things from the filtrate back into the blood, right? So it's just a difference of direction. Both of them are active processes because we're moving things against their concentration gradient. All right. So in Sam, right, so what happens is your body recognizes penicillin as something that is not normally supposed to be in your blood. And so the kidneys actively secrete it out into the urine to try to get rid of all of the penicillin molecules that are present in that blood traveling through all of your 1 million nephrons, right? And then you pee it out. So you know when you eat asparagus and then later you go pee and your pee smells like asparagus? Same thing. That molecule that gives asparagus its smell gets actively secreted by the kidneys out into the urine. And so this is why when we take a medication, you have to take it often multiple times per day, right? It's not like we usually just give people, oh, here, take a pill of penicillin and it'll just stay in your body for 10 days. No, it won't, right? So our bodies have these systems to actively remove waste or foreign compounds. So most medications, you have to take them usually at least once a day because either your kidney or your liver is getting rid of them for you. Because remember, the liver works kind of as a sewage treatment plant. So when we study pharmacology and we study how drugs work in the body, one of the things we look at is it the liver or the kidney that ends up excreting them, and how, right? And at what rate? Okay, so that's secretion. So most often when somebody has renal failure or kidney failure, the problem that first develops, right? So if it's failure, it means they're not doing their jobs properly. And usually the one that is the problem earliest on is secretion. So if we think about what would happen to somebody with renal failure if they can't do secretion normally, right? So what would their urine be like? Would it have more stuff in it or less stuff in it? What do you think? Damon? It would be less stuff in it, right? If you're less able to secrete, you're less able to move molecules from the bloodstream into the urine, particularly those waste molecules. So there's going to be less ammonia, urea, and uric acid in your urine. Instead, where is it going to be? In your blood, right? So in renal failure, what happens is these waste products start accumulating in your bloodstream because your kidneys are unable to get rid of them for you. And unfortunately, we don't have a backup mechanism to help with that, right? And as these waste molecules build up in your body, it makes you sick. And if we don't treat it, right, eventually it will cause your death. Right? These are waste products. They cause problems for us if they build up. Right? So what do we do for people who have kidney failure, renal failure? Does anybody know what the treatment is? Yeah. So a transplant would be one option, absolutely. Yep, we could give them a new kidney. Those are hard to come by. It is absolutely dialysis. So this is a gentleman getting dialysis. So let me show you what they do. This is crazy that people figured out that they could do this. So the way this works is he has two tubes in his arm. One tube is taking blood out of his body and through this machine. This machine is doing filtration, reabsorption, secretion, water balance for him. And then that blood goes back into his arm through different blood vessels. So people who have renal failure get dialysis periodically, basically to clean out their blood for them. Right? It's pretty crazy that somebody figured out you could do this, and it's wonderful and it's life-saving. Right? So usually people will have this done about 3 days a week. So there's a dialysis center here in Menominee, not at the hospital, but across the street, kind of across from the elementary school there, behind the Quick Trip. And people go and they sit there for about 3 hours to get their blood cleaned out. It's pretty amazing that we're able to do that. All right. Questions? Yeah. Right, so good question. So the question is, are these people who are just waiting for a transplant, or is this kind of like for the rest of their life they're going to get dialysis 3 times a week and this is just what we do? For most people with renal failure are older, towards the end of their lives. So for most people, this is going to be the treatment that they get for the rest of their life. Transplants are scarce and hard to come by. So usually those are reserved for young people. So then you can kind of get a lot of years out of that transplanted kidney. Not always, but in general. Yeah.
What would be the cause of kidney failure?
The cause of kidney failure. So the most common causes of kidney failure are things that lead to atherosclerosis, lead to problems with blood flow to the kidney. So those things that we talked about way back with the circulatory system. So diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, smoking. Diabetes is a really big one. Diabetes is especially hard on the kidneys. Yeah. Other questions?
Is it possible for
Is it possible for a human to pee blood? Yes. Right? So if you have a kidney stone scratching up the inside of your ureter or the inside of your bladder or the inside of your urethra, you will pee blood. Right? If your glomeruli are leaking, so remember that first case, Glenda, what will happen is you will lose blood cells because your glomerular capillaries are too leaky, so blood cells will leak out into the filtrate, but it doesn't look bright red. It ends up looking weird after it goes through the whole kidney, so it kind of looks more like iced tea. But yeah, bladder cancer can also cause you to bleed into your urine. Yeah. And sometimes urinary tract infections will cause blood in the urine too, just because the inside of the bladder is so inflamed and irritated. So in folks' urade, most of the time, if you have blood in your urine, it's usually a urinary tract infection. And not anything to be terrified of. Something to get checked out for sure. Other questions? All right. We have one more job of the kidneys. So we'll talk about Wally. He's a wrestler. And so he's been competing all day, sweating a ton, maybe even making himself sweat extra so that he can make weight for his weight class. Right? So sometimes you'll see wrestlers will put on these those practically plastic suits and run around in them to try to get really hot to sweat extra so that they can weigh less when they go to get weighed in. So he also hasn't been drinking any water, and he goes to the bathroom and notices that there's not a lot of urine that comes out, and it's pretty dark in color. So when you see a solution that is dark in color, right, that means that it's more concentrated. Okay? There's less water per whatever amounts of solutes you have, right? Obviously, if I add water to this, it's going to turn a lighter color. So when you see darker urine, there's lots of potential different causes, including inflammation of the glomeruli and leakage of blood cells. But the most common cause is going to be that it's simply more concentrated, right? So there's less water in that urine. So what's going on? This is job number 4, water conservation or water balance. So the kidneys are in charge, along with the brain that's going to mediate your thirst. The kidneys are in charge of how much water they let out into the urine. And they will know how much or how little, depending in part, I'm simplifying it, but depending in part on a hormone secreted from the brain called ADH. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. That's kind of a mouthful. Diuretic means peeing a lot. So it's anti-peeing a lot hormone. Okay? So what will happen is, if the brain is making ADH, it's telling the kidneys, don't let more water out than you have to. And so what will happen is special channels called aquaporins are going to open up in the tubules, and water will be able to move back out of the filtrate, out of the baby urine, and into the blood vessels. Okay, so this is like reabsorption, but of water. And it's kind of complicated how it happens. It's actually passive, it's not active, because of a concentration gradient that the kidneys set up in this region, right? But so if the brain is producing ADH, you will pull water out of the urine and back into your blood. That will mean there's less water in your urine, you pee less volume because there's less water, and it is darker, it is more concentrated. If you are well hydrated, then the brain will not make ADH. These gates will be closed, and the water will stay in the urine. And the urine will look really dilute, and it will be large in volume, right? So if I, chugged a liter of water throughout the lecture today, by the end of our lecture, I would probably have to go to the bathroom, and it would be really pale urine in color, right? The urine would be really pale, really light yellow, or maybe even kind of clear, right? That means generally, unless you have a certain medical condition, you're really well hydrated. Sometimes maybe a little bit too hydrated, right? We talked about that way back in the beginning when we talked about osmosis. Remember, water intoxication, you can drink too much water too quickly. That'll cause water to move inside your cells and lyse them. Okay? All right, so we need to have a lot of really robust systems for regulating total water volume. This is one of them. This is one of the major ones. So while he was dehydrated, right, he was low on body water. So his hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain, made ADH hormone. So those channels opened up and water was moved out of the urine back into the bloodstream. So then the urine is more concentrated. It has less water in it. So this happens in all of us every single night when we're asleep, right? As I mentioned last time, while you're sleeping, you're not drinking anything, right? And so gradually, because every time we exhale water vapor. So we're constantly losing water from our bodies all the time. In medicine, we call those insensible losses because you can't really measure it. We can measure how much somebody pees, but we can't measure how much water vapor they breathe out. It's about 400 cc's a day. It's a little less than half a liter. It's a decent amount. So while we're sleeping and it's hailing water vapor into the environment around us, right, our brain goes, ooh, we're starting to get a little bit dehydrated. It's going to secrete ADH. So those aquaporins, those channels in the kidney are going to open up, allows water to be moved out of the urine back into the bloodstream. We're like, nope, we don't want to pee that water out. We need to hold onto it. So that's why in the morning when you wake up, right, if things are operating normally, your urine looks darker than it does during much of the day. Which is also why, if you've ever had the need to do a pregnancy test, a lot of times they will tell you to take it first thing in the morning because your urine is more concentrated, right? Things are less dilute. So if they're trying to detect a certain solute, right, it's a little bit easier to find it if the sample isn't too dilute. So let's talk about Lily. So she has a gastroenteritis, like a stomach flu, right? So she's been vomiting and having diarrhea all day. She calls the health center, and one of the things the nurse asks her is when did she last urinate and what color her urine was. So this can actually give us a lot of information about what's going on in somebody's body, right? If the answer is, well, I just peed an hour ago and it was medium yellow, the person is not too dehydrated, right? They're doing okay. That's good, right? If they say, I haven't peed in 12 hours, and when I last did, it was a very small amount and it looked like iced tea, that's really concentrated, right? Maybe that person needs some IV fluids or some other treatment. Okay? So you can actually use the appearance of your urine as kind of a gauge. And so it's interesting, you know, from time to time, it's not as big a deal as it used to be, but for a long time, everybody was like, drink more water, drink more water, drink more water. And people were like drinking way more water than they needed to, right? Which just meant they had to go to the bathroom more, right? But you can use your thirst, and you can use the appearance of your urine to get an idea as to how well hydrated you are. So if your urine is really, really pale or close to clear, you are way hydrated. You can back off, right? So just kind of, you know, lemonade. Right? If it looks like apple juice or iced tea, then you're getting pretty dehydrated. All right. So, okay. So I forgot about this one. So Jack read that drinking a lot of water is good for you, right? So this is that example, right? Saying he's drinking a lot of water even though he's not thirsty, right? So overriding the normal physiological signals that we have evolved over millennia to help keep us in balance, right? So if you're drinking a lot of water, what happens to your blood? Does it get more concentrated or less concentrated? Yeah, less concentrated, right? There's more water in it. That's potentially dangerous to you. So is the brain going to make ADH or going to not make ADH? It's not going to make ADH. It's going to say, please let that water go out in the urine. We've got more than we need. So then your urine's going to be really dilute. It's going to be really light in color or clear, right? Because the kidneys are going to be letting it all go. All right, remember Pete? So he's back. He got better from his pancreatitis, but he's still going out and partying. He hasn't learned his lesson. All right, so Pete is out drinking with his friends, and he's peeing a lot. And he feels like he's peeing even more than he should based on the volume of beer he's been drinking. And then in the morning, he just feels awful, right? He feels really dehydrated. His mouth is all cottony. He has a terrible headache. So part of this is just alcohol, right? Alcohol is a toxin, and it can make you feel like crap. So part of it is just being hungover from that. But part of what a hangover is actually alcohol interferes with your brain's ability to make ADH. So in the presence of alcohol, your brain can't make ADH, can't tell your kidneys to hold on to water, so you pee it all out. So you end up more dehydrated than you otherwise would be, right? So you can't conserve water. So a big part of hangovers is actually being really dehydrated because you've interfered with your body's own ability to regulate its total water balance. So, and people are like, oh, drink a lot of water before you go to bed, before you go to sleep if you've been out drinking a lot of alcohol. You're just going to pee it out. I mean, you can try, right? You can try. Might help a little bit, but you're not going to be able to keep it very well. Questions on water conservation? All right, this is the job of the nephron. So we've talked about all 4 jobs, right? So filtration at the glomerulus, passive, water and small molecules move out and form the filtrate. That's the first time it comes into existence. Then reabsorption, right? We're going to take things that we want, that we don't want to pee out of the filtrate back into the blood. Then secretion, any wastes that are still left over in the blood, we're going to move out into the urine, into the filtrate. And then water conservation, right? So if we need to, we're going to take some water out of the urine and back into the bloodstream. So that's how the kidneys make urine. It's really quite complicated. All right. Kidneys also do lots of other things. So there's just a few things that I want you to know about. One is they make some hormones. One is called renin, and it's really important for regulating blood pressure. The one that you might have some familiarity with is called EPO, or erythropoietin. And so you'll remember when we learned about the blood, that our red blood cells are erythrocytes, which have no nuclei in them, only live about 90 to 120 days. So we're constantly making new ones all the time. The signal to our bone marrow to make more red blood cells is EPO, which is made by the kidneys. Right? They're like multi-talented, the kidneys. They're like, oh, we just don't excrete wastes. We do all this other cool stuff too. All right. So they make EPO. So sometimes we find that too in people who have kidney failure, that they get anemic. They don't have enough red blood cells because their kidneys also aren't able to make EPO to tell their body to make more red blood cells. So a lot of times we'll give them shots of EPO. The kidneys are also responding to a whole bunch of hormones that help us with salt and water levels and blood pressure and blood volume. I'm not going to ask you about those, but I just want you to understand that that exists and that actually the kidneys are some of the most complicated organs we have. Nephrologists who are kidney doctors, they are some of the smartest people you will ever meet. The other thing the kidney does, which seems totally random, is they activate vitamin D. So this is going to take us down memory lane again to when we talked about skin, right? So one of the functions of skin is to produce vitamin D in response to exposure to UV light. The vitamin D that's produced in the skin is not yet active. It has to travel through the bloodstream end up down in the kidneys where it gets converted to its active form. So kidneys are doing lots of things for you besides making pee. But making the urine is super duper important. All right. Let's see how you're doing. So pull out your phones. We'll do